Hej Ein Manners och välkommen till podden EU och ekonomi.
Tack.
Du är professor vid Lunds universitet.
Precis, ja.
Och har forskat om EU i många år. Hur många år är det?
Det är 32 år jag har jobbat med EU-frågor. Länge sedan.
Ja, du är en av våra främsta forskare inom EU och du har ju tittat mycket på maktfrågor inom unionen.
Ja.
Och det ska vi prata lite om idag.
Okej, perfekt.
Och Ursula von der Leyen, EU-kommissionens ordförande, höll ju sitt State of the Union-tal här nyligen. Vad är ditt intryck av det?
Super. Nu jag ska ta på engelska. One of the most interesting speeches given in a State of Union speech since they were introduced over a decade ago. Interesting in the sense that she is talking openly about the change in fortunes within the EU, particularly spurred by the after effects of economic and pandemic crisis, and in particular, the events in Ukraine. So although she does talk about environmental issues and the crucial importance of the European Green Deal, about economic and competitive issues, extremely important, the arrival of digital technologies and AI, the most important component is her switch in position, echoing that of Charles Michel, the president of the council, to turn the EU round to opening up to enlargement as quickly as makes sense. And that is extremely interesting within the context of the applications by Ukraine and Moldova for membership, the hopes of Georgia, perhaps even Armenia for membership, and certainly the existing series of Southeastern European applications. So in total, we have really 8 live applications for membership of the EU. And this is changing and has changed the dynamic of European integration within the EU. And that's really interesting. Exciting, but of course very challenging for all member states.
Verkligen. Och om vi pratar om utvidgningen där, nu med nya medlemmar, hur ser du på det? Vi har ju förlorat en medlem i Storbritannien, kan du själv, du som kommer från Storbritannien. Om vi tittar på de här nya, hur ser du på det? Är EU redo för nya medlemmar?
Yeah, no, the EU isn't ready for new member states, but then it may not have been ready for Swedish membership back in 95. So there's always a lag behind the institutional changes that need to be made for enlargement and the process of enlargement itself, which is often driven by dramatic geopolitical events. And certainly the membership of Finland, Austria, Sweden in 95 was a feature of those dramatic events, as was the enlargement to the 10 Central and Eastern European countries in the 2000s. And of course, these events now today, in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, are really driving the rethinking of existing applications for membership and the newer membership applications. And so this is very exciting, but it now means that there is much more thought being given to, okay, what do we have to do to prepare for enlargement? And a number of existing member states have outstanding concerns about the negative consequences of previous rounds of enlargement. Just to remind people, the system that was introduced to penalize countries that broke the fundamental values of the EU was introduced with Austria in mind after the Austria sanctions crisis in the 1990s. Never was it thought that 2 member states would break these rules at the same time. And this is a situation you have with Poland and Hungary. So those mechanisms, for example, were constructed for another world. Similarly, the concerns and risks around potential funding and corruption need to be really rethought if we're going to have accelerated enlargement to new member states, which do not have a long history of rule of law, democracy, human rights, as we have here in Western Europe.
Och hur menar very interesting. Hur behöver vi rethink? Hur vi ser på de viktiga frågorna med demokrati och rule of law?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in particular, the older member states, and this would include France and Germany, but it includes most countries of Western Europe who joined in the previous century, really want much stronger rules and regulations governing the ability to monitor and, if necessary, punish member states that join and then subsequently break rule of law, corruption, democracy, human rights, with the possibility of pushing them out of the core of the EU and into a sort of surrounding relationship, a little bit similar to the European Economic Area. Obviously, members of the European Economic Area, like Norway, don't like that idea, but there must be real costs and consequences for rule breaking in the enlarged EU. And this is a very new debate in some respects. It's been rumbling on for about 10 years of how on earth do you deal with countries that have, unfortunately, long histories of corruption, long histories of breaking the fundamental rules, not just of the EU, but of the Council of Europe. And so this is really, really interesting times, but it does carry risks for countries that are not whole members of the EU. So in the past, this has been the UK. Today, Denmark and Sweden are nominally outside of the Eurozone. And so this potentially runs the risk of leaving member states with long histories of membership actually in the second tier of the EU. And Franco-German proposals, and I've seen many other conversations and heard many other conversations, reflect this thinking. And so Sweden has to go very careful that it doesn't get caught out by a system of rules that are essentially introduced to deal with and think about a much greater enlarged European Union of 30 plus. I mean, potentially we're talking about 35 or more member states in the not so distant future.
Så vad du menar är att vara utanför euron kommer bli någonting större ju mer EU utvidgas. Då kommer vi i bakvattnet, är det så du menar?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that already happens. If you're not in the room for the Eurogroup meetings, you're not sitting in on the agenda of setting the economic direction of the EU. Back in 2007, 2008, I did a report for the European Committee of the Danish Parliament. We looked at the long-term consequences of Denmark being outside so many areas of cooperation. And the one area that really punished Denmark, even though the Danish crown has been linked to, through a fixed exchange rate policy, to the euro since 1982, the one area was economic agenda setting. Because it was not in the core of the Eurozone, it wasn't really about setting interest rates or discussing the rules and regulations of the Eurozone. It was about being in the room when the beginnings of the most important and interesting economic decisions were being discussed and taken, even if they were subsequently taken in a meeting of economic and finance ministers, which would always follow the Eurozone meeting. So you can see how the Eurogroup meeting is the agenda setting part of the single market, in particular the Eurozone. So there is this risk for Sweden. It's really unfortunate because Sweden is in many respects a core member state of the EU today. It is a very, very important economy within the EU. Its ideas and principles around democracy, human rights, rule of law have today been the sort of the part of the central core of what the EU is, and particularly feminist foreign policy would be an example of this. And yet, in many respects, it's playing the B game in economic terms, which is really, really unfortunate.
Playing the B game, det är ingenting man vill göra framåt. Om vi tittar på ett annat land som inte var in the room, som du säger, det är ju Storbritannien. Och hur ser du på Brexit? Vad har hänt med EU efter Brexit? Man tittar mycket på vad som har hänt med Storbritannien, men hur ser du att EU har påverkat av Brexit?
Absolut. Ja, vi säger på svenska det är hemskt. Det är min scream face. An absolute national catastrophe. Beyond the realms of anything that's occurred for over 2 centuries in Britain, since Britain became a relatively modern democracy. A catastrophe in economic terms, that was predictable. Nobody denied there would be significant economic consequences. What people hadn't thought about is that these would be continuing, ongoing, and potentially accelerating economic consequences. The UK is estimated as taken about a 4% hit to GDP, wiping out gains over the last 20, 25 years in economic terms, but the real consequences are social. The UK has in effect become not just the worst economic performer within the EU and within the group of seven, but it's become one of the more impoverished, more unequal countries. This was always a problem in the UK. You know, the residue class system in the UK undermined equality in the UK, but today it's just absolutely terrible. And it's appalling for younger people who today have no hope of escaping through migration as previous generations did. And of course, the political consequences have been catastrophic. The extent to which you've had 5 completely inept prime ministers rule the UK over the last 5 to 10 years, and the way in which they've mishandled issues such as, well, let alone corruption. Let's talk about the pandemic and how such a large number of people passed away through COVID-related illnesses and deaths is just an absolute national tragedy, of which we in the rest of Europe and the EU look upon this as being the worst case scenario for any country, particularly one that's an international trading partner like the UK, is to leave the single market, to leave the EU. So yeah, that's my screen face.
Och när vi ser på utvidgningen nu som du var inne på, nu ligger ju ett förslag från Tyskland och Frankrike, ett framtidsförslag. Vill du kommentera det? Är det här enda sättet man kommer fram i framtiden på, så som Frankrike och Tyskland föreslår?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there have been a number of suggestions by groups of think tanks, and this is just one of them, by French and German academics, all of which reflect, I think, broader thinking across the policy world and across the EU policy world of what could, might, and should happen in this accelerated process towards membership. Not only driven by Moldova and Ukraine, but also driven by the concerns and the resentments of countries who've sat a very, very long time in southeastern Europe waiting for membership. The Franco-German paper suggests creating tiers or circles of European integration. In a way, these have always been present in the EU, but making them far more structured. The outer tier of which is the French idea of kind of European political cooperation, which would include the UK. The next British Prime Minister certainly will not accept that and will want to move to an inner tier of let's say the European Economic Area, which would include, for instance, Norway and Iceland, but potentially other member states who have applied for membership but aren't ready for full membership for reasons of poor records of human rights, rule of law, corruption, democracy, etc. And this is where it gets more controversial, particularly for Sweden and Denmark. Another inner tier of kind of second order member states who aren't full members of the EU. And this would potentially include those countries who've not yet joined the euro, potentially want specific opt-outs on certain areas and want to retain them. So obviously countries like Poland and Hungary would initially fit within this range, Bulgaria, Romania, potentially Denmark and Sweden. Now, this is a horror scenario for any of these countries, because it runs the risk of them not being in the room for most of the economic and political agenda setting, as they generally are in the political sphere. So the inner core, and this is certainly an idea that's been very popular in France, but is gaining acceptability in German political circles. The inner core would be those current member states who are full members of the EU in all respects, seek no opt-out, seek no special treatment, and are willing to accept the kind of rules that are in place for the ordinary legislative procedure, that is qualified majority voting. And so this is the idea that's actually been around for some time, and in some respects has already been operating in the single market. But were this to be accepted either within a treaty change, or if this is too controversial, and this is likely to be the case, through intergovernmental agreements that are outside of the treaty base, this is actually a disaster for Sweden in many respects. So Sweden has to do everything it can to shape, change and reposition itself in this debate as one of the core members of the EU. And that's absolutely crucial.
Jag vet du, Arjan, det var min sista fråga här, för att du går in på den ekonomiska politiken och nu har ju euron pratats väldigt mycket om i Sverige. Inte på grund av utvidgningen egentligen, utan på grund av att kronan är så dålig och man inser att det här är viktigt för Sverige. Men att sätta ihop euron med utvidgningen, det är ju en helt annan aspekt, otroligt intressant. Så nu när EU rör sig på det här sättet, hur tycker du, förutom den ekonomiska politiken då, att Sverige ska göra för att maximera inflytandet framåt och bli en stark, bra EU-medlem fortsatt?
Yeah, absolutely. Really important this. And I think there's something important to say. I teach political economy, in particular international political economy. And that's different from, let's say, mainstream economics or market economics, in that it takes into account the political consequences and context of the way in which economies, in particular Sweden's economy, one of the most internationalized economies in the world. If you thought Brexit would be horrific for an economy that's internationalized, Sweden's economy is probably a third to 50% more internationalized than the British economy. So it's not even worth thinking about the consequences of removing Sweden from the EU. That would be worse than a national disaster, if anything is imaginable. So when we talk about Sweden's membership of the euro, we have to talk on one hand about politics and on the other hand about economics and put them together. A number of changes have taken place in the global financial economy since the global financial crisis and the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis of 2008 to 2013. And one of this has been the realization that there's a delinking between balance of payments, current accounts, that is how well your economy is doing, and the way in which that is strengthening or weakening your exchange rate. Market economics tends to believe there's a link, and this is a fairly firm link, that if your economy is doing well, and Sweden's economy is doing well, then its currency would be stronger. The truth is, in political terms, is that's a belief system, not a strong, demonstrable economic link. So in the past, the Swedish economy, after it climbed out of the disaster of the 1990s, has done well through membership, probably far better, like Denmark, than most other member states. But today, its currency is doing badly because it is a free-floating economy in an international currency in an internationalized economy next to one of the world's two largest currencies. So if the euro goes down, currency investors invest in the Swedish krona, the value of the krona goes up, the Swedish economy overheats, the price of housing, etc., in Gothenburg, Stockholm, Malmo explodes. And this is what we saw during the Eurozone crisis. If the Eurozone is doing well, people disinvest from Sweden. It's seen as not as an attractive location. And this is also happened, and pressure has also occurred on the Swiss currency and the Danish currency, even though the Danish currency is fixed through an exchange rate mechanism. So you've seen a delinking of the relationship between the functioning of the real economy and the behavior of the currency. This will get worse. There's no doubt of this. There's a tendency, and you see this when you watch Swedish TV, to see economists say, we expect things to return to normal. No, there's no evidence of that. The world's economy is becoming more financialized. The Eurozone, as it grows through enlargement, and it will, all new member states want to join the Eurozone at the same time as they join the EU. If Sweden doesn't do this, its economy, and particularly speculation against its currency, will get worse with every enlargement. Now, there's
om jag sammanfattar det du säger nu, Arjan, så är det svårt att egentligen komma bort från det ekonomiska här. Att det är så viktigt att Sverige går med i EMU för att allt annat ska fungera. Så att det är egentligen det viktigaste vi behöver göra för att bli more influential on the European scene. Är det korrekt uppfattat, eller finns det annat vi också behöver göra som inte handlar om euron och ekonomin för att ta vara på möjligheterna nu med utvidgningen?
I mean, one of the problems is that we tend to assume there's a sort of a logic at work here, that membership of the euro should be driven by logics. In fact, it's image. One of the reasons I think why disinvestment in Sweden is taking place is driven by a range of speculative pressures about not being within the core of the Eurozone, within the core of the European economy. This may not be entirely true. The Swedish economy is relatively speaking very strong, well balanced, great export records. But if people start to believe that Sweden isn't at the core of the euro, isn't at the core of the EU, those types of speculative images of Sweden in the global economy become worse, even if they're not entirely true. So there's, on one hand, there's the real absence of presence in debates around Eurozone, the direction of the European economy. And then secondly, there's the types of beliefs about, is Sweden a full member of the Euro? No. Is Sweden a full member of the EU? You know, and given that you know, Sweden has been very active in moving closer on defence, security and other issues, which have helped strengthen Sweden's security and prevented the increasing intrusion of Russian air flights, for instance, over Swedish airspace. It's really got to be given this wider political observation and reflection upon why it's so important for Sweden to think about and debate in real terms, not in hypothetical market economic terms, what the consequences of being outside of the Eurozone are, and how that it's not obvious that things will get better. In fact, in most observations, I think things will get more speculative and more risky for Sweden the longer it stays outside the Eurozone.
Jätteintressant, Ayan. Tack så jättemycket för den här diskussionen. Så det handlar alltså om att Sveriges varumärke försämras och blir sämre. Man undrar om Sverige egentligen är med, och att bilden i sig av att vi inte sitter i rätt rum kan skapa problem för oss framåt när EU utvidgas. Jätteintressant. Jag får säga tack så mycket för att du tog dig tid att prata i podden EU och ekonomin med mig.
Tack så mycket.